All right, in this section, I'd like to delve more into the relationship between stress and weight, because it turns out it's a complicated one. So there's a few different key things we want to talk about here, and one is in terms of how stress affects energy mobilization and how that differs in the short term versus the long term, right? And so when we first were learning about stress in the initial lectures, we talked about zebras and the way that they might respond to stress in order to get away from a predator, right? And so in that case, the goal is to mobilize a lot of energy and to release blood glucose into the bloodstream. And so this is what occurs at the initial onset of a stressor, right? We see significant activation in the sympathetic nervous system, particularly that SAM axis that we talk about, the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, right? That takes care of dilating your pupils, getting your heart racing, getting your lungs going, getting you ready to cope with that initial threat. And so that, again, mobilizes a lot of energy, pulls a lot of energy from storage and into the bloodstream in the form of blood glucose, because that's one of the quickest, most efficient forms of energy that we can use is sugar in our bloodstream. And so your body goes through processes to engage that. And it also suppresses your appetite, right? Because it does, although you do need more energy, it takes energy to process food. And so rather than inducing you to want to eat and need to process that energy, which is tiring, you are using stored energy and what is available already in your bloodstream. And so you have that significant sympathetic nervous system activation, particularly that SAM axis, and via the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, we see a suppression in appetite as well. So there's two things going on here. But what's key, and again, we're not zebras, right? And so usually, in many cases, the kinds of stressors that we face now are not ones where we actively need to run away and actually use all of that energy that we've mobilized, right? So maybe it's the fact that I'm stressed about, I don't know when these construction workers are going to make another noise and ruin my video here. And that I don't actually need to run away or use any energy here, so I just have a lot of extra blood sugar in my bloodstream right now. And so when I don't use that, what's going to happen to it, right? And so we learned in just the last section here that any excess energy, right, we're going to store away. And particularly if we're under stress, we're more likely now to restore that excess energy as fat, particularly visceral fat on the abdomen. And so this is one of the ways in which either facing repeated stressors, right, where you're mobilizing all this energy but then not using it, then storing it away, is not only physically exhausting in the process of converting that energy back and forth, but also you're then preferentially storing this as fat and as bad fat. And so it's not good to be stressed out often in that way. As well, also, if you are stressed chronically, right, and so we have, in that case, more activation of that HPA axis of your sympathetic nervous system, right? So if you recall our stress lecture again, we talked about there, that's the axis that's responsible for the release of glucocorticoids or cortisol, right? And so interestingly, cortisol has an opposite effect to CRH on appetite. And so in this case, it actually stimulates your appetite. And so chronic stress can, in that way, stimulate your appetite when you have greater levels of cortisol relative to CRH, right? So when you have more activation of the HPA axis versus the SAM axis. And so when that's been more activated, we are more likely to eat more. And this also slows our metabolism down, right? And again, this would have been adaptive if we were under chronic stress as early humans. You don't want to waste energy. You want to use all of that very efficiently. And so your body starts to do so. And so you'll hold on to every calorie in a way that you might not have previously. And again, with the release of cortisol, you'll be increasing energy storage as fat for later use. And so, again, having repeated acute stressors as well as more chronic stressors can lead to weight gain through these processes, right? Through activating and then storing away excess energy, or through ultimately stimulating your appetite and slowing your metabolism. Another really interesting question with stress and weight, right, is why that some people eat more when they're stressed, and some people eat less. And so evidence suggests that about 2/3 of people become what we call hyperphagic or overeat when they're stressed, and about 1/3 report that they undereat or are hypophagic under stress. I guess I wrote that there twice. But why is this, right? Why do we see this individual difference here? And there's a few different things going on here, right? And so just recalling our previous slide there, right? It depends in part on just the relative balance between that SAM and HPA activation and the relative amounts of CRH and cortisol that accompany that activation. And so when there's more SAM activation, then you're more likely to see that suppression of appetite. People are more in that fight and flight response longer, and so they're having that suppression of appetite relative to that HPA activation. If you have a lot of both, it really just depends on which one is winning out, right? Are you having more cortisol or more CRH? And because of individual differences in genetics and the way that people psychologically respond to stress, people may have different levels of activation of those two things. And so that's one thing that accounts for this. It also really matters about the timing of the stressor, right? And so similar in the way that when we talked about autoimmune disorders, that chronic stress can seem to have counterintuitive effects, right? Sometimes when we have really prolonged, strong chronic stress, it seems to suppress the immune system in those people and help their autoimmune disorder. But when there are these repeated short-term stressors during that recovery period, it's actually ratcheting up the immune system. And a similar thing can happen here with eating, right? And so the idea is that you have an initial stressor in these repeated acute stressors, and so what happens then is I have that activation of the SAM axis and it suppresses my appetite, but then I start to recover from that, but the cortisol takes longer to flush out of the system, and so during that recovery stage from stress, I'm likely to eat more and have a stimulation of appetite, and so it may be less that you're actually eating more when you're under stress. Technically, you may be in that recovery period when you're eating more. And so, again, these individual differences in whether people eat more or less under stress really depends a lot on psychological factors in terms of how you perceive a stressor and the physiological reactivity and individual differences in the relative activation of these two arms of your sympathetic nervous system, right? The SAM axis and the HPA axis, and whether you secrete more CRH or more cortisol. And so this is a really interesting question. You can see these psychological and physiological factors come together here in determining this. Just a fun comic here, right? So stress also just can impact our hunger, again, in the way that we talked about here with suppressing or stimulating the appetite, particularly when we're recovering from stress or under really chronic stress, wanting to eat more. And also, particularly, people seem to crave these high-sugar, high-fat foods when they're under stress or when they're recovering from stress. And again, this is something that would have been adaptive, right? These are very efficient foods energy-wise, and so this would have been adaptive. And then also because of the serotonin in sugar, it feels good to eat that. And so eating these foods literally can be stress reducing physiologically. And so while that may be good for your stress levels, if you are trying to diet and trying not to eat these types of foods, stress can make it more difficult to do so. Stress can also impact weight and eating through a number of other more indirect mechanisms. Firstly, when we're stressed, most of us are less likely to exercise. I certainly know a few individuals who do a great job coping with stress through exercise, but for many of us, it's one of the first things that goes, and really the second one being the next one we'll talk about, which is sleep, right? So when you're stressed, you may be likely to exercise less, which, as we're going to see in the next section, can help us cope with stress. And so, we're stopping doing one of the things that could help us the most. And again, I'm guilty of this as well. And then the second thing that often goes is our sleep. When we're stressed, we're less likely to sleep. We talked about that in our previous lecture, right? Stress can keep us up at night, among other ways that it impacts the quality and efficiency of our sleep. And unfortunately, when we don't get enough sleep, the neural activation, so what's happening in our brain, looks fairly similar to when people are hungry, right? Your brain is depleted, it needs more energy, and so it also will seek out more food. So you may feel more hungry when you're tired and eat more then. And so again, if you are trying not to do so, that's going to undermine that. And so stress certainly can lead us to gain weight in that way. But as you learned in Tracy Mann's article, and we'll have talked about in the discussions this week, but diets themselves and just the fact of restricting calories can increase stress. And physiologically so, they saw an increase in cortisol among women who were on a restricted calorie diet. And so, as we just saw, that can then stimulate your appetite and lead you to hold on to more calories. And again, this would have been adaptive in many circumstances, right? It is a physiological stressor for your body to get less nutrients than it thinks it needs. And so it activates these stress responses to conserve that energy. And so that's another way in which efforts at dieting and at losing weight can be undermined. And before I turn to the next section on exercise, I just want to say all of this is not to undermine the importance of eating healthy and people's efforts at doing so, but I do think it's really important to recognize the effects that stress does have on the body and why it can be so difficult to lose weight. And I think this is important both at the individual level and giving ourselves the tools that we need to overcome these types of stress so that we can be effective in these goals, but also so that we can set reasonable goals. And I'll talk more about that as well in the end here. So I'm getting awkward here, so I think I will wrap up this section. And then we're going to turn to talking a bit about exercise and its efficacy in weight loss and also some evidence to its lack of efficacy. But then we'll turn to talking about all of the benefits that do come from exercise and the evidence that supports that.